It's a Security Weekly News, episode 184 on the 4th of February, 2022. We have got gets Zucked, MFA threats, DHS, Elementor, LinkedIn, and all the show wrap-ups on this episode of the Security Weekly News.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week. Your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for Security Weekly News. Monitoring and maintaining compliance is a never-ending struggle with a high price of failure. FIREMON helps customers meet complex and varying compliance requirements. FIREMON has fully customizable reporting, analytics, assessments, and dashboards to meet the compliance needs of any organization. With FIREMON, compliance reports take a tenth of the time, and real-time continuous compliance eliminates the anxiety and headaches of audit preparation. Improve security outcomes by improving security operations with FIREMON. Visit securityweekly.com/FIREMON to learn more. Every 11 seconds, there's a new ransomware attack. Oil pipelines, universities, corporations, all paying millions of dollars. Barracuda says, don't pay the ransom. Before a ransomware attack occurs, train your teams to recognize an attack and use anti-phishing technology. Protect your applications, and they can't get onto your network. Simple backup and restore solutions quickly recover your data without paying the ransom. Build your ransomware protection plan now by visiting securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda.
All right, I'm Doug White, and this is the Security Weekly News wrap-up show. This week on Application Security Weekly number 182, John and Mike had Larry Maccheroni. He's in charge of DevSecOps transformation at Contrast Security, and he was on. Larry came on the show to talk about shifting left, something we've talked about a lot. But he was talking about something that was very interesting to me, which is how adaptation of this is actually a real issue. I mean, basically, whenever some buzzwordy kind of thing comes out, and we all know this, we get asked these questions from C-suite or whatever, and like, why aren't we shifting left or what have you? If you really go after these things and you don't truly understand how to do them or the impact that they're going to have, or you have a team that actually is willing to and can apply these things in some kind of modern and effective way, well, it's probably not going to work out the way you thought. So an interesting segment. In the second segment, PwnKit LPE in Linux, 2 different smart contract logic flaws in 2 different hacks, a 100,000 bounty for Safari, Python, NAN coercion, and AppSec games. On Business Security Weekly number 247, Jason Lee and Matt had Dan Matthews, the Director of Worldwide Sales Engineering at Constella Intelligence. Dan was talking about how, and again, a very relevant story to me, Dan was talking about how your information is pretty much everywhere. And that every time there's another breach, which is constantly, I mean, there's so many breaches we don't even really, when I first started doing the news years ago, I often reported on breaches, oh, there was a new dramatic breach this week. But today I don't even bother because there's like a breach every day. But there's so many breaches. How do you protect your organization from impersonation and account takeover attacks that are being used currently? So again, a very relevant and timely segment. In the second segment, they had news, cybersecurity increasingly on audit committee agendas. Good to hear. CIO involvement in security grows as CEOs target risk reduction. How poor security culture leads to insider risk, and other stories. On Enterprise Security Weekly 259, Adrian, Katie, and Larry had Attila Tarak, the head of security at Zapier, on the show. And Attila was on talking about experiences dealing with 500 plus remote employees that were scattered across the globe, and how do you actually defend a cloud-based company with a remote workforce and remote infrastructure. Again, a very timely guest talking about something that I think all of us are dealing with at some level. My dealing with it has been a lot lower level than somebody with that many employees, but a lot of you have a lot more employees than that. In the second segment, Darwin Salazar, a cloud security consultant at Accenture, joined the show. If you don't know Darwin used to be an intern at Security Weekly. when I very first started working on shows a long time ago now, it seems like it was just yesterday, but it was actually a long time ago. Darwin was an intern over at Security Weekly, and I'm glad to see he's all grown up and a pseudo-responsible, or at least as responsible as somebody who worked at Security Weekly could ever become. But Darwin was on the show to talk about Sentinel, which is Microsoft's cloud-native SIEM. And they were talking about what features it has and so on. So a nice little segment there. And then in their third segment, they had the news. And on the Security Weekly News number 183, Jason Wood was on talking about recent attacks on German service station petrol terminal providers. So very similar to some of the attacks that have happened in the United States in the last couple of years, like Colonial Pipeline and so forth. There were attacks in Germany being hit with ransomware. On Paul's Security Weekly number 726 on Wednesday night, first up was Brent White, no relation. Brent is the principal security consultant at Dark Wolf Solutions. A really, really fun segment, so you should definitely check this out. Brent was talking about everyday carry items that could be used for covert entry assessments. So that was immediately of interest to me. Talked about how to hide all this stuff and what kind of tools were used. And, of course, this is all about white hat pen testing stuff, white hat physical testing. So all the tools they use, what kind of assessments they were doing, much more sophisticated stuff than my old toolkit from the good old days, which mostly had a wrecking bar in it. But, that works too. On the second segment, Paul does a tech segment and a walkthrough of Linux post-exploitation. And I think everybody's enjoying the tech segments a lot. So if you do enjoy them, be sure and let them know in Discord so that they'll keep doing them and do more of what you want to hear. In the third segment, the news. My thread of the week is going to be tracking. On the Tuesday news show, I did a story about pixel, like just translucent pixels being put in email to use to track what you're doing. And this week, there was another story about the use of video cards as a tracking mechanism. And I immediately saw that. I was like, that's interesting. And, I mean, I'll be honest. I truly think that this is a losing battle. I really do. Been obvious to me for a while that the value of your behavioral data is very, very high to marketing people. My old friend Lou was working for a major company who I shall not name, but it was decades ago, and they were spending a lot of time and energy and hiring really, really smart people like Lou to look at just understanding how people walk through a store. Like, what path did they take? Why did they go here first? Why, what kind of different people do you have? And Lou was doing a lot of AI type stuff. I guess today we would probably call that, it was like deep learning type stuff. But he was working with a lot of different kind of things like that to try to help them understand that. And the value of what he was finding with these neural nets and other AI tools he was using was really, really high to them. I mean, they were paying a lot of money for this. And, because if you can even make a small change at scale, when you're talking about hundreds of millions of transactions in these stores a year, if you can make even a small change, you cause people to buy an extra jar of peanut butter on their way to get beer or whatever. Lou was famous for finding a relationship between beer and diapers late at night. But, they've got the money. I mean, because you're talking about serious cash here. So this particular story was about fingerprinting video cards. And in particular, what they were doing was they were able to log the speed variations between the GPU execution units. So this was the actual instructions going to the GPU in those video cards. And they found out that, at least according to the article, that a simple unprivileged JavaScript strip, ooh, Freudian slip, Freudian strip, a Freudian strip today. But just the JavaScript or JavaScript, I don't know. That's probably a new club for programmers. But they could use this script to actually discern between two fingerprints, even if they had similar hardware. Like, wow. And now I don't know that we need to go to such lengths to track anyone. So I'm not excessively concerned about this kind of stuff that's going on, because there's so many things already tracking you, right? I mean, we currently allow them and welcome them into our lives, like our phones, like software, all that kind of stuff is already all tracking you. I mean, if every single piece of software that you have is connected to something off-site, then they're tracking the IPs. They're probably fingerprinting you in other ways, and they're using and you're using that willingly, right? You probably allowed it. You installed it yourself. You gave it the privilege that it needed. But I think that this thing with the video card was just another nail in the coffin of the anti-tracking crowd. Now, don't get me wrong. I am completely against tracking, especially covert tracking of users and their behavior, and I wish that it wasn't allowed or that it was stopped somehow, but I do just think it's going to be a battle that we're never going to win. There's too much money involved on the back end, and the identification of user behavior, the identification of consumer behavior is something that companies will spend immense amounts of money to understand, because every little bit counts because it's at scale. You're talking about millions and millions and millions of transactions. If you can change behavior just a small percentage, multiply that times the pennies that are affected by that, and all of a sudden it's a real number. And those marketers really, really, really want to get at you. So this particular story I didn't think was that much to worry about. Like, you don't need to rip your video cards out and throw them on a bonfire at this point. It isn't really a remote thing, although I guess they could implant the JavaScript somehow, like maybe you buy a game and it's got that JavaScript embedded in it so that it runs, and, you've given it permission and click that OK, 9 times to install the game. And at this very moment, my phone knows where I am. It probably knows that I'm over here at the studio. The computer I'm writing on has probably 3 or 4 different apps that are tracking my location by IP or other means. And most likely Microsoft is tracking how fast I type, how many words per minute, what I'm typing, and whether or not I'm wearing pants. Is Logitech looking at me through my camera or tracking what my camera did and how many hours I used it yesterday? Is Avast looking at what my apps are doing and which apps I have and what they're connected to? Probably. I would guess if I provided free Wi-Fi in a store, and my friend Lou and I had talked about this years ago, if you gave them free Wi-Fi and they had to click an agreement to get the free Wi-Fi, then you could just track them. Because this was a conversation they were having. How do we track the user? Do we put something on the shopping cart? Do we put something on ask the user to carry something around? All of the above. But if I gave them free Wi-Fi, I could probably just track them while they're in the store. And a lot of us are already conditioned that way. We say, free Wi-Fi? Sure, of course, go right ahead. My oven is tracking what's going on and probably reporting into the Thermidor Death Star somewhere right now. My car, wow. How many ways can my car actually be tracked? My car is always online. It's online right now. I can see it on my phone saying, I'm sitting out here in the rain. That's going to turn into ice. In fact, I got an alert from my car that the weather was going to be bad. So, I think my car is probably reporting on me. My phone in my car is reporting to Waze. My Easy Pass is reporting when I go through a toll booth on the Jersey Turnpike. Not sure how you avoid all that unless you just truly go off the grid. I think you'd have to buy like a 1959 Chevrolet Biscayne or something and line it with lead and then only drive on unpaved roads in northern Maine if you really wanted to avoid detection. But, of course, a 1959 Chevy Biscayne is so big, it's probably detectable from space, so it probably wouldn't help. You can only buy gas with cash, and even then you have to buy it in cans and carry it back to the car, which you parked out of sight, because there's probably an ATM machine at the gas station, which has a camera which is tracking your every move. So in the end, I don't know if it's a threat or it's just going to have to be something that we learn to live with and it becomes part of our whole way of life. And I get it. Really, there's been plenty of evidence in the last few years that there are people in the government who may well want to use your personal data to see what you're doing, and they may well use that data against you if you don't do what they want. And that is scary. But I do think it's a losing battle unless you want to live off the grid. There's cameras everywhere. All your devices are tracking you. Even medical equipment that soon is going to be implanted in your body is going to be reporting in. And all that data is going somewhere, probably to Lou, although Lou is dead. So it may be going to Lou through a Ouija board or something. But anyway, now I really need to run home and make a bunch of tinfoil masks so I will be protected. But we'll do the news first. All right. So remember how MFA was going to fix everything? Well, maybe not. I don't agree with that truly, but MFA has been rapidly adopted to some degree, although I've got a story that's going to counterpoint this in a second. But according to this article, it's been rapidly adopted to stop phishing. And according to article, 78% of the respondents to the article study said they used MFA in 2021. Now, I don't know who the respondents were because they didn't have all that data there. But as you might suspect, the minute that these kind of things start happening, new routes for scammers have to be exploited. The latest thing, and it's not really the latest thing, but it's becoming more heavily used, is a transparent reverse proxy. So, and you've probably heard us talk about these things before. We've certainly been seeing this. A lot of these reverse proxy attacks have been around for a while, but they've been used in the past to get around port address translation and other kinds of mechanisms like that. But according to Proofpoint, who was the primary source for this article, they said that attackers are now doing these transparent reverse proxy attacks to get around MFA, which makes sense. Essentially, it's an injection into a session. So the MFA is still in place, but if they can inject themselves into your session somehow, then the MFA doesn't really matter, right? So you log into a legit site using MFA, but the attacker is sitting in on the session and they can steal all the session cookies. And of course, once they have the session cookies, well, you know how that ends. Modliszka is an old one that's from Poland, and it basically uses Let's Encrypt. So this was an early form of this, and basically what it does is the fake landing page uses Let's Encrypt so that you get the little padlock. And, everybody that's been trained in this stuff has said, oh, I have to check that padlock. And I've been to that training, and, be sure the padlock is locked. And so they give you a legitimate looking URL. I say URL sometimes. It drives Paul crazy, but URL. Padlock is locked, and all of a sudden, boom. Another one is called Necro Browser, and this one came out in 2019. There's two pieces to this one. The first part runs server-side, so somebody's got to compromise a server to put this in place, and that part of it is called Miriana. And that particular part of this is used to assess that traffic is going to be rewritten effectively. So they're actually intercepting packets and rewriting them, and they don't want to alert the victim that this is going on. And what it does is it grabs your credentials and it grabs all your session cookies. Okay, so already in trouble. But then Necro Browser is the second part, and once it's grabbed your credentials and the session cookies, Necro Browser gets deployed, and at that point it can basically use the stolen information to log into the target site, change passwords, disable notifications, and all sorts of hijinks using your credentials. Another one they reported on was EvilGenix 2, and it's written in Golang, so it's a little more modern, and it was originally created as a pen testing tool, like probably a lot of these things started their lives that way. But this product uses pre-installed things called fishlets, which are used to manipulate the targets. And users can write new fishlets and contribute them and so on. But the point of this article, I think, is that these tools have been redirected now to target MFA in particular as it becomes more heavily used. And all these tools are widely available. They're pretty easy to set up and use. And stealing session cookies is certainly an effective way to avoid MFA. Now, with that said, Microsoft released a story this week that said 78% of organizations who were using Active Directory currently do not use MFA for their user accounts. So that's kind of a counterpoint, although it's a more specific group. This was based on Azure Active Directory services, and the report also released this particular shocking, I don't know if it's so shocking to us, they called it a shocking number, 25.6 billion. And no, that's not how much Bill Gates made last year. This was the number of identity attack attempts trying to brute force accounts that were detected in 2021, just on Azure. So that's a lot. I mean, that basically translates to about 600 attacks per second. Now, I mean, we're all familiar that brute forces are running all the time. Brute forcing never sleeps. It's always out there. So despite that story, the previous story, Microsoft says that 99.9% of the attacks would have been prevented if you used MFA. And I don't disagree with them, despite that first story, but people are not adopting it as fast as they should. And Okta said that Office 365 accounts without MFA were 10 times more likely or even higher to be targeted than MFA accounts, which makes sense completely to me. So it's a really good article if you're interested in this. It's actually readable by your C-suite people. So if you want to pass that along and maybe try to encourage them to adopt MFA, and you probably should be doing that. I mean, you really need MFA. I mean, despite that first story, yeah, there's always going to be ways around things, but every thing you put in the path makes it more difficult to get to what they want to get to. And every time you put that up, they'll find a way to get around it, but the more difficult you make it, the less likely it becomes. And just in case you weren't worried about ransomware, Kronos The paymaster in charge of paying, well, pretty much everybody got taken out back in December. So if you work for a company that uses Kronos, back in December they got taken out with ransomware just in time to keep Dagwood's Christmas bonus check from arriving in time for the big day. Kronos said at the time it would take several days to get all their services restored, but it has now been almost 2 months. And they're still slowly trying to get their private cloud systems back online. And that meant that a lot of employees were not getting paid for a while. They were not getting paid overtime. People were having to do all this stuff manually. Companies were literally having to do manual, I don't know if they had old time card type stuff or they were just writing it in a book or what, but it was basically a really big mess. NPR reported that 8 million people were experiencing administrative chaos after the attack. A class action lawsuit has been filed by the New York Transit workers against the MTA. I guess, and then MTA would have to file a lawsuit against Kronos. But the lawsuit's about failing to pay overtime wages since December. So, again, they're having reporting problems. Tesla, PepsiCo, they both filed lawsuits against Kronos, and there's probably others already, writing their lawsuits as we speak. But the point, or at least my point is, you need to ensure that you have a plan, because this is going to continue to happen. And whether you're a consumer or you're a provider, you need to have a plan for how you're going to get back in business when you get ransomware. And these lawsuits are going to establish precedents that will, lawyers don't tend to go away when money's involved. So you're going to increasingly need to be able to deal with these kind of attacks, or you're going to get got. And by got, in this case, I don't mean ransomware. I mean, you're going to get got by lawsuits. So, plan ahead. The Department of Homeland Security has established a 15-member cyber safety review board this week. I guess my invitation got lost in the mail or something. But the group's first task is an investigation into Log4j last year. President Joe Biden established the CSRB with an executive order last May, and this will represent the first time the group has been charged with an investigation. The goal of the group will be to make recommendations that can help both the public and private sectors improve their response to future threats. The first report from this group on Log4j is expected this summer, so be interesting to see what they come up with and report. The Elementor website creation toolkit for WordPress has a massive issue that can allow data leakage and remote code execution. The plugin in question is called Essential Add-ons for Elementor, and the attackers were able to trick this plugin into accessing a server-side file using a file name that is supplied by the incoming request. So this is a kind of attack we've seen before, right? But now here's another exploit that takes advantage of it. Basically what this would do is you can cause the server to actually serve up a page or a file that should not normally be seen, and all you really have to do is guess a file name. And so this is an old school kind of web attack. But basically what it does, if you know the file name you want, you can request it, and the server then pushes it to you, which means you could get database files, you could get all kinds of different things. Like in the old days, this was one of those tricks where people would some of these attacks were called directory traversal attacks, and they would ask for the shadow and the password file on Linux servers, and if you had both those files, you could use John the Ripper to crack all the salts and basically get the usernames and passwords for that system. So this same tactic can also be used then to get the server to actually execute a script. The article does have a lot of details on how this server-side include attacks work. If you're interested in such things, and it does offer some mitigations. Basically, their recommendation, of course, is that you patch to version 5.0.6 or later, and please validate your inputs when you're developing websites, or you're going to get got. Krebs reported on threats from LinkedIn.com, and I read that and went, oh, no. Most of us have a presence on LinkedIn, and we do use it for professional social networking. So I comb my hair and stuff and put on a necktie so I look all professional on LinkedIn. But it's been a sort of solid space in terms of not hitting you with too much ad stuff. Not a lot of attacks and things have come out of LinkedIn. But apparently, there's a feature that's available to businesses in LinkedIn that is a redirect feature, which allows customers to track ad campaigns and links to offsite resources and so forth. And they're called slinks or S-links. I don't know how you pronounce it. I'm going to call it slinks because it sounds cooler. All these slinks then have a very similar format, and they allow redirects to other content. So you can send out something from LinkedIn that comes from LinkedIn, and it actually has a redirection in it to another page. So, of course, scammers can register new LinkedIn accounts, or they can just get access to existing ones through credential stuffing or whatever, and they cause an apparent link to a LinkedIn kind of site to be sent out to various people, but it actually redirects the victim to a scan site. Uriscan.io, or I'm sorry, not Uri, urlscan.io, which is a free service that if you've ever used it, will give you a detailed report on a scanned URL, and I've used it for that. But it showed dozens of phishing attacks that have been conducted using this Slinks Fisher in LinkedIn. The example in the story was a site that looks like Adobe and then asks for your Microsoft credentials in order to view a document that theoretically started at LinkedIn. So the point is here, you may want to push out some guidance to your people that you can't even trust legitimate-looking links like LinkedIn, to be actually legitimate links. And finally, well, Zuck finally got zucked in the Zuck. Facebook, which is now called Meta, even though everybody still says Facebook, but the company is officially called Meta now, and they have like an infinity symbol or something like that. So they reported for the first time since the creation of Facebook originally that it actually lost users. The first such time in 18 years. I mean, at some point, you have to get everybody you're going to get, right? I mean, everybody that you can possibly sell to using this thing has signed up. And, given the recent track history of Meta, lying about tracking people, misinformation, subsequent changing of the old name to respin the narrative and sit out the news cycle and all those good things, well, it's not really that shocking to me that they lost users at some point. The bigger problem, of course, was the fallout from the report. The stock dropped 26% on Thursday, which is a pretty significant stock drop, and that resulted in about $220 billion of value evaporating for shareholders in Meta. Facebook said they were refocusing on the metaverse, but that really hasn't taken off in the past. I'm not sure everybody's convinced that that's going to be the next big thing. I mean, I'm sure eventually somebody's going to figure out a way we can all hang out and do weird things virtually with headsets and, various the sundry USB components. But at the moment, I'm not totally sold on that. I do think there's a finite number of cute cat pictures that grandma can post, and by grandma, I mean me. But, as such, with all the competition from TikTok and everybody else, Zuck's probably going to have to call the Winklevoss twins or somebody and get some new ideas in there if they want to, keep rolling. And that is the wrap-up for the week of 30 January 2022. I'm Doug White. I hope to see you next week on the Security Weekly News.